one of the key elements of any good speech is evidence. And the other day when we talked about your thesis statement, your evidence is all built around the thesis statement. And so that's why having a really great thesis statement is important, because it sets up how you do your evidence. So we're going to look at 4 really important things this afternoon in terms of your evidence. First, definition and purpose. The thing I want to really emphasize here is the idea that the evidence is the support material for your thesis. It builds it up, it explains it, it illustrates it, it even entertains the audience, I guess, a little bit, so they pay attention to it. The second purpose, which I think is just as important, is the whole idea of building the speaker's credibility up as someone who's an expert in that area, that has some believability when it comes to talking about that particular issue. Now, what exactly is evidence? How would you define it? Well, it's simply evidence, information used to support a thesis. That's all it is. You simply give information to support a thesis. And so that's the definition. So if you're looking for it on the test, that's what it is. And so you build your purpose in terms of those factors. Well, how do you do that? Well, you use the different types of evidence. There are 4 of them, and we're going to talk about each one. The first one is a fact. And a fact is something that's not in dispute. Nobody can dispute that fact. Let me illustrate. I'm 5'7", 190 pounds. That's a fact. You put me on the scales, you measure my height. That's a fact. It's not in dispute. Now, how I feel about being 5'7" and 190 pounds, that's a whole different thing. That's an opinion. That's not fact. My weight and height are facts. And so good speakers will find solid facts to put in the presentation. Okay? A second kind of evidence is testimony. And what testimony is simply one person vouching for the other. Let me give you another example. That would be where a student comes to me at the end of the semester and says, "Hey, Mr. Willis, would you write me a letter of recommendation?" What he's asking for is evidence. He's asking for me as an instructor to testify for him, to say, this is a good student, you should reward the student with a scholarship to the next phase of his education, or whatever it is that the student's going to use that for. And so that's a piece of testimony. And the testimony is only as good as the person giving the testimony. In that particular example, myself. Okay, a third kind of evidence would be an example. In a speech, I might want to try to illustrate something, and so I might tell a story. Maybe I'm doing a funeral oration, and the person that's passed, I want to illustrate how humble and how kind they were. So maybe I'll tell a story about he gave some money quietly without telling anybody to support a student or to help a friend that no one ever knew about. So I would tell that story to illustrate his humbleness, his kindness, right? The fourth kind of evidence is statistics. And a statistic is simply a listing of occurrences. How often does something happen? Let's say here in Galveston County that every year the number of accidents go up by 100. Say one year it was 100 accidents, the next year it's 200, and so forth. Well, then based on that, I might predict that in the coming year we would have an increase of 100. And what would I base that on? The fact that that's happened in the past. And so that statistic is a piece of evidence moving that claim forward, if that's the argument that I'm going to make. Okay, the third area, is the sources of evidence. We have 2 kinds, primary and secondary. And primary evidence is evidence that comes from a source that has first-hand knowledge of that situation. Let's say that I walk out my front door, there's an accident, and I see it, I witness it. Okay, that's what we call primary evidence. When the police come and they say, "Hey, Mr. Willis, you happen to be standing outside your door, what happened?" And then I would tell them what I saw, right? Now, let's say that I tell my wife later in the evening, she comes home from work, and I share what I saw with her. Well, then she tells it to someone else. Well, that's not primary evidence because she wasn't actually there. She's just repeating what I said. It's kind of like gossip, because that gossip is secondary. Well, did you hear about what happened? And so the idea here is to get the primary evidence, not the secondary evidence. Now, sometimes you have to use secondary evidence, and that's okay, but you need to have reliable sources that have credibility with your audience that they'll believe. All right, the final aspect that I want to cover today is documentation, meaning how do you present the evidence in your speech? So if I'm quoting from someone, I would say, here's a quote by Winston Churchill or by so-and-so or so-and-so. So the first thing you're going to do is give a source for that piece of evidence, right? And I'm going to say, according to, from, this magazine, this website, whatever it is, and then I'm going to say, here's what they said. And then I'll actually give the evidence. Now, the evidence might be any one of the four types. It might be a fact, a statistic, an example, or whatever. It might be any one of those four. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about who said it, because that adds to the credibility. And this goes back to your audience analysis, because you need to find sources that you know your audience will relate to, that they'll connect with, that they'll believe. And here's the key element to the whole process. When I'm choosing my evidence, I want to make sure that I pick evidence that's going to be forceful and powerful and connected to my audience so I can get the best result from that presentation.